Late autumn 1944. Moscow was already cold, the kind of cold that sharpened sounds and slowed breath. Inside the Kremlin, however, the atmosphere was heavy for a different reason. Joseph Stalin sat at the long polished table, the green-shaded lamps casting hard pools of light across maps that had been unfolded, refolded, and marked so many times that the creases had softened like cloth. Red and blue pins crowded the eastern half of Europe. For years, those pins had crept west at a cost that defied numbers. Tonight, they were no longer creeping. They were surging. For Stalin, this was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of calculation. The war had taught him to distrust sudden good news. In 1941, he had ignored warnings of the German invasion. In 1942, he had watched entire Soviet armies vanish into encirclements. Victory, when it came too easily, often hid a trap. Yet as reports arrived one after another from staff officers who rarely allowed themselves optimism, a different truth was becoming impossible to avoid. Germany was not merely being pushed back. Germany was unraveling. The first signs did not come from dramatic speeches or intercepted declarations. They came from numbers, rail movements, tank counts, replacement schedules. Stalin understood industry as well as ideology. He had built the Soviet system on production quotas and 5-year plans, and he judged enemies the same way. Germany's strength had always been its ability to turn defeat into recovery. After Moscow in 1941, after Stalingrad in early 1943, the Reich had returned with new formations, fresh equipment, reorganized divisions. That pattern had now broken. The reports crossing Stalin's desk told the same story in different languages. German divisions destroyed in Belarus were not being rebuilt. Panzer units that should have received dozens of new machines were receiving handfuls, sometimes nothing at all. Luftwaffe sorties over the Eastern Front had thinned to a fraction of their former strength. Pilots captured near the Vistula spoke not of bold counter-offensives, but of shortages, fuel rationed by hours, ammunition counted round by round, aircraft grounded for lack of spare parts. When Operation Bagration had smashed Army Group Center in the summer of 1944, Stalin had initially suspected exaggeration. The destruction was too complete, too absolute. Whole German armies had disintegrated. Hundreds of thousands of troops were listed as lost, captured, or missing. The scale rivaled Stalingrad, but with one crucial difference. At Stalingrad, Germany still had reserves. Now there was nothing behind the broken front. Stalin leaned back in his chair as Zhukov spoke quietly, methodically, pointing to the map. The Germans were no longer withdrawing in ordered steps. They were fleeing until they hit another line, then breaking again. Their defensive belts were thinner each time, their counterattacks shorter, weaker, and increasingly desperate. Soviet reconnaissance units were reporting something almost unheard of earlier in the war. Abandoned equipment in serviceable condition, tanks without fuel, artillery pieces without crews, supply dumps destroyed by their own side rather than risk capture. This was the moment Stalin began to understand that Germany's collapse was structural, not tactical. It wasn't just that the Red Army had become stronger, though it had, enormously. It was that the German system that once compensated for losses no longer could. Factories were being bombed by the Western Allies day and night. Railways were shattered. Synthetic fuel plants lay in ruins. Even when tanks rolled off assembly lines, there were no trained crews left in sufficient numbers to man them properly. Captured documents confirmed it. German replacement battalions existed mostly on paper. Units at the front were being filled with teenagers, older men, and fragments of other destroyed divisions. Training periods had been slashed to weeks, sometimes days. Officers taken prisoner admitted that they no longer expected victory, only survival. For a regime built on the illusion of invincibility, that admission was fatal. Stalin listened, expression unreadable. He did not interrupt. He had survived purges, betrayals, and disasters far greater than this, and he knew better than to show reaction too quickly. But internally, a shift was taking place. For years, his primary fear had been survival. The Soviet Union had teetered on the edge in 1941. Moscow itself had nearly fallen. The enemy had stood within sight of the Kremlin spires. Ever since, his decisions had been shaped by the question, how do we endure? Now a different question was emerging. How far could they go? The evidence mounted week by week. German radio intercepts revealed frantic arguments between commanders, requests for permission to retreat unanswered or denied, orders to hold positions to the last issued where no realistic defense existed. The old German operational flexibility, the ability to trade space for time, had vanished under rigid political control. Hitler's grip had tightened as reality slipped away, and that grip was strangling his own army. Stalin understood this dynamic well. He had ruled through fear himself, and he recognized the signs when it turned counterproductive. Armies under terror could fight fiercely for a time, but eventually initiative died. Decisions slowed. Officers waited for orders rather than act. On the Eastern Front, that hesitation was lethal. By early 1945, the Red Army was advancing faster than Soviet logistics were designed to support. That, more than anything, told Stalin the true state of Germany. In earlier phases of the war, overextension had been a mortal danger. Now, forward units were seizing intact bridges, intact cities, sometimes entire headquarters, before German commanders even realized they had been bypassed. The enemy was no longer dictating tempo. They were reacting badly. One evening, Stalin studied a report detailing German fuel stocks. The numbers were stark. The Reich's remaining reserves could not support both civilian needs and sustained military operations. Choices were being made, and the front was losing. Armored units were being held back, not for strategic brilliance, but because they could not afford to move. For Stalin, a man obsessed with resources, this was the clearest signal of all. Wars were not lost by bravery alone. They were lost when economies stopped breathing, yet Stalin did not relax. If anything, his caution deepened. He remembered Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, how quickly apparent victory could turn to disaster if overconfidence replaced discipline. He demanded more confirmations, more intelligence from different fronts. Reports from the Balkans, Italy, the Western Front. Everywhere the picture was similar. Germany was being pressed from all sides, its responses shrinking with each blow. The Western Allies' advance mattered here more than many realized. Stalin had long feared a separate peace in the West, a deal that would leave the Soviet Union facing Germany alone. Instead, he saw the opposite. Anglo-American bombing raids were systematically destroying the industrial heart of the Reich. Their armies were pushing toward the Rhine. Germany was bleeding resources in multiple directions, unable to concentrate strength anywhere. At a meeting with his senior commanders, Stalin asked a question that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Not whether Berlin would fall, but when and under whose boots. The room fell silent. Everyone understood the implication. The war's end was no longer theoretical. It was approaching with alarming speed. Zhukov and Konev exchanged glances before answering carefully. The distance to Berlin was measurable now, not metaphorical. The German defences east of the Oder were thin, incomplete, manned by units that existed more in name than reality. Still, Stalin insisted on restraint. He ordered pauses to consolidate lines, rebuild supply routes, and rotate units. He knew that Germany, though mortally wounded, could still inflict terrible damage if cornered. Berlin would not be taken in a rush of emotion. It would be taken deliberately at a time and place chosen by the Soviet command. Privately, Stalin reflected on the irony. The state that had once come within days of annihilation had grown into the dominant force on the continent. Germany, which had launched the greatest invasion in history, was now unable to defend its own borders. The balance of power had not merely shifted, it had inverted. The moment of realization did not come with a single report or announcement. It settled gradually like winter snow, covering every calculation. Germany was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to delay the inevitable. Every kilometer gained by the Red Army shortened the war not just in distance, but in German capacity. Every loss was permanent now. By the time Soviet troops reached the Oder River, Stalin no longer doubted it. Germany was falling apart from the inside out, militarily exhausted, economically broken, politically paralyzed. The question was no longer whether the Reich would collapse, but how much of Europe would be reshaped in the process. As Stalin stood once more before the maps, he allowed himself a rare, silent acknowledgement. The danger that had threatened his rule, his country, and his ideology was ending. What followed would be no less complex, no less ruthless, but it would be fought from a position of overwhelming strength. Germany's decline had ceased to be a battle of armies. It was the collapse of a system that could no longer sustain war. And Stalin, hardened by years of catastrophe, understood something few men ever grasp so clearly. The moment an enemy cannot recover, the war is already decided.